In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. This morning, I'm going to talk about Judas. And so I have to give you a warning that there will be one brief mention of suicide. Judas is mentioned in both of our scripture readings this morning, although you have to know where to look for him. Our gospel reading from John comes from a passage that scholars sometimes call Jesus' farewell discourse. It's the night of the Last Supper, the night before Jesus is betrayed and arrested and tried and killed. Jesus is praying out loud to his Father, a prayer of protection and care for his disciples. And he's doing this before they all go out together to the garden to face his trials and ultimately his death. As part of this prayer, Jesus reminds God how he has cared for his disciples, how he has loved them, how he has guarded them, not losing any one of them except for the one who was destined to be lost. I think what we see here, and actually really through all the Gospels, is a kind of embarrassment over how to deal with the problem of Judas. Over and over, our Gospel writers seem almost to be apologizing for having to include Judas in their stories. Or we see them trying to work out how to deal with the reality that so often in the Bible, Jesus is walking around with a traitor right in his midst. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when Jesus appoints his 12 disciples at the beginning of his ministry, Judas is always referred to as Judas Iscariot, the one who became a traitor. We learn of the other disciples simply from their names. Simon, who would become Peter, James, and John. The gospel writers don't refer to Peter, who would deny Christ 3 times, or James and John, who would demand places at Jesus' left hand and on his right. We learn these things, we witness these failures as we follow Jesus and his disciples throughout their story. But from almost the very beginning, Judas is defined by his treachery. The gospel writers set things up so that Judas is prejudged in a way that none of the rest of the disciples are. And this embarrassment about the Judas problem, this is actually the focus of the first reading that we heard from Acts. Jesus chose 12 disciples, and 12 is a significant number in the Bible. It represents the 12 tribes of Israel. But because of the Judas problem, the roundness of Jesus' symbolism shatters. Where Jesus originally calls 12 in the days following Jesus' resurrection, a ragged edge of 11 disciples remain. Perhaps betraying their own embarrassment about the Judas problem, the editors of our lectionary today have actually omitted the verses from our reading this morning that describe what happened to Judas. In verses 18 through 20 of this chapter, which you did not hear read, the author of Acts tells us that in the days following Jesus' death and arrest, Judas buys a field with his ill-gotten silver. He obtained the silver from the chief priests as payment for betraying Jesus. And the author of Acts isn't clear about what happens, but somehow Judas has an accident on this property. He falls, and his body is split open, and he dies a horrible, gruesome death. Interpreters have sometimes conflated this account in Acts with the story of Judas's death in Matthew. In that story, Judas is filled with grief over his actions. He attempts to return the money to the chief priests before he hangs himself. In that story, the chief priests are the ones who buy the field. since they are too craven to just accept this returned money, this blood money, back into the temple treasuries. In the beginning of our reading from Acts, Peter has gathered together a crowd of Jesus' followers because there is a Judas-shaped hole in their community. So the disciples cast lots, and they elevate Matthias, a follower of Jesus from the beginning, who saw Jesus' baptism in the Jordan with John and went with them all the way through the death and resurrection. And Matthias is chosen to take Judas's place as one of the symbolic 12. When I was a kid, the story of Judas really bothered me. As I understood it at the time, the point of Jesus coming to earth is that he's supposed to die for our sins. So it seemed to me that Judas was an essential part of this story. Someone has to start the awful chain of events that lead to Jesus' arrest and his trial. Why was Judas vilified for doing something that seemed like it was supposed to be part of God's plan from the beginning? That did not seem fair. Later, when I went to seminary, I learned another interpretation of Judas's story. This tradition emphasizes Judas's identity as a zealot. The Zealots were a radical political party that sought to incite the people of Judea to rebel against the Roman Empire. The Zealots wanted these common everyday folk to revolt and expel the pagan invaders from their holy land by force. So this tradition sees Judas's betrayal as a kind of misguided way to help Jesus. See, Judas thinks that if Jesus gets arrested, he will finally be forced to act and resist violently. He will have to overthrow his Roman oppressors and ultimately lead all of the Jewish people to their political freedom. When Jesus does not do this, when he does not rebel, and instead accepts his fate and remains docile up until the end, that's when Judas realizes the depth of his miscalculation. Judas is a problem and an embarrassment because he calls into question so many things about God's plan. It does seem like somebody somewhere must have gotten something wrong. Certainly, Judas is wrong about the kind of Messiah that he thinks Jesus should be. The constant hedging that our gospel writers do, the repeated reminders that Judas is a betrayer, seem to be their attempts to prevent us from thinking that maybe it's Jesus who was wrong. Maybe Jesus was wrong to pick Judas in the first place. And at times, it seems to me like maybe it's even God's plan that is wrong. I think that this might be why a couple of our gospel authors insert the devil into Judas's story. They tell us that Satan entered Judas's heart, motivating Judas's betrayal, because the alternative to this explanation is that God's plan for salvation hinges on the ultimate act of divine child abuse, requiring the death of an innocent man. The problem with Judas is a problem that gets to the very heart of the Christian faith, because the truth of God that we see in the life of Jesus and that we see in the story of Judas is that God does not work in neat, tidy patterns. God accomplishes God's plan of salvation through messy, flawed human persons. Like the story of so many of our own lives, the story of God's work in the world is full of false starts, embarrassing plot holes, scandalous mistakes that we would rather not talk about. Remember, it's not just Judas who is a failure as a disciple. Think about Peter. Peter betrayed Jesus, not face to face with a kiss and calling him teacher, recognizing him for who he really was. Peter denied knowing Jesus at all. And then he ran away and he hid right when Jesus needed him the most. Peter is not expecting forgiveness any more than Judas is. But 3 days later, Peter gets it. When Jesus returns and he unexpectedly gives back to Peter everything that Peter has betrayed. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and Jesus comes back to bless Peter 3 times. And Judas's tragedy is that he just didn't make it those 3 days. If Judas could have hung on for a little longer, I think Jesus would have returned to him too. I think Jesus would have forgiven this unforgivable betrayal with a kiss. But Judas didn't survive the 3 days that Jesus was in the tomb. But I don't know that that means that Judas is lost forever, irredeemable, trapped in a hell of his misfortune and mistakes. As Jesus hung on the cross, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus experienced being forsaken by God. And so Jesus knows what it means to be trapped in a hell of misfortune and mistake, cut off from the source of life and hope. Judas didn't make it until Jesus came back to forgive him. So instead, Jesus followed Judas into God-forsakenness to go and get him. Jesus stretched out his arms and died so that each and every one of us who find ourselves beyond the reach of God, trapped in our own hells of mistake and misfortune, will have a companion on our journeys of despair as we walk out. As Christians, we need Judas's story to show us what Jesus' death and resurrection are really about. However much we'd like to paper over our faults, explain away the places in our own stories that embarrass us, where we don't look so good, where we misunderstand, where we fail, where we let other people down. It is exactly in those places that God is at work. That is why we can have hope for Judas. And we can have hope for the Judas that is inside each and every one of us. Because in Jesus, we know that the God-forsaken are always given back, unexpectedly, undeservedly, and they are returned to new life in God. Amen.